Hi everybody. In this video, we're going to look at emissions drivers or what causes global warming pollution. And in this video, we're going to take a human systems approach. So we're going to look at different aspects of society and how things like population size, the amount of wealth, and the different technologies that humans use to produce those things can contribute to our emissions. So one way we can model these relationships is with the Kaya identity or the Kaya equation. And what this attempts to do is to model or show the different contributors to global warming emissions. So the total amount of emissions is determined by things like population size and how much each person is emitting for the goods and services that they need to survive. This further breaks down into two components, income and technology. So income basically means how much money is in a society or how many goods and services that people have. So basically, the more stuff we have, basically the wealthier we're considered to be. And things like income are good measures or very similar to this as well. So basically, the more money we have, the more money we tend to spend on different things. Technology basically means what we use to produce that stuff or what we use to produce those services. So we need electricity, we need materials like steel and cement to build our homes, to build our consumer devices and stuff like that. So all of those activities are also releasing emissions. Technology further breaks down into energy intensity and carbon intensity. And we're going to look at both of these concepts in a little bit more detail. Now, when we look at the total emissions, basically, this suggests that everything can be determined by essentially these factors. And while this seems a little bit complicated, the basic ideas are relatively simple. Think about population, income, energy intensity, and carbon intensity as the contributors to global warming. One thing I would also like to point out at the bottom of this equation here is this term GDP, which we will occasionally see in this course. And that's simply a fancy term for the goods and services that are produced by an entire population. So for example, we regularly track the GDP of different countries. And we use this information to determine things like whether a country is a high wealth country or a developing country. And GDP, again, is simply another way of saying income or wealth, just a fancier term that social scientists sometimes use. So the Kaya identity points out that population size has an influence on the amount of pollution or emissions that we produce. This has led a lot of people to ask if reducing population and population growth is one of the ways that we can solve climate change. And it is true that reducing the population and the population growth can help, but there's a lot of problems with this approach. First of all, one of the problems is that in the past, there have been a lot of efforts to control population growth that were undemocratic and unethical. So in the 1960s, when overpopulation became a major concern with a lot of different groups, including environmental groups, they basically advocated that we should be promoting birth control. And in a lot of poorer countries, they suggested that this was so important that we didn't necessarily need to get the consent of the women who would be subjected to a lot of these procedures. So women were often targeted with birth control, with things like intrauterine devices that prevent pregnancy, and this was often done without their consent. There are also cases where men were sterilized without their consent as well. So there'd be people who would go to the hospital and they'd be getting some unrelated procedure done, and scientists, without obtaining consent from those individuals, would essentially prevent them from becoming pregnant in the future. So again, to reduce population growth while ignoring people's human rights is obviously extremely problematic. And this is one of the reasons why people are very concerned when there's a focus on lowering population size or population growth. Another thing that's also important to point out is that world population growth is already slowing down. And this has actually been happening for quite some time. Around the world, we see that people are having fewer children and preferring smaller families, and we see this especially where women become educated. When women become educated, they can work and earn more money, and they often decide to have fewer children as a result, because children often make it difficult to balance work and family together. One thing we do need to point out, however, is that given the pace of global warming, is that while population size is going to slow down eventually, we are still expecting about 10 billion people by around the year 2050. And in any case, reducing population size is going to be too slow as a solution. So perhaps we wouldn't have as much global warming if we only had, say, 1 billion people around the world, and perhaps population will be that size in the future. But at the rate global warming is going, it's simply going to take too much time to get to a more sustainable population size. The final 2 points that I want to bring up are very closely related, and it has to do with the countries that have fast-growing populations versus those that don't. Countries like Canada and the United States have very high emissions per person. We also have low fertility rates, so families are much smaller and the average woman has fewer children. A lot of the poorer countries, by contrast, have the opposite. People tend to have bigger families and more children, but they're also polluting less. The reason why this matters is that if we focus on population size alone, we're ignoring that a really big driver isn't the number of people, but how much each of those people are consuming. In other words, the world could support a really large population if we were all consuming less. And if we focus just on population size, we're ignoring the role that different technologies can play in reducing our emissions overall. This graph highlights the past 2 points on the previous slide very clearly. This is a graph that shows per capita emissions, so that's simply a fancy term for per person. So what this means is that the amount of pollution that's being produced by each person on average. Now, when we look at countries like the United States and Canada, which are among the wealthiest countries in the world, we actually see that the average person is producing more carbon dioxide per person. So in Canada and the United States, the average person is producing about 15 tons of carbon dioxide or its equivalent every single year. Now compare this to the countries of China and India. China is considered an example of a high middle income country, and India is considered a low middle income country. Both of these countries, while they have much larger populations and are producing more pollution overall, are producing a lot less per person. So in the case of China in 2021, the average Chinese person was only producing about half as much pollution as the average Canadian or the average American. The average Indian was only producing about 1/5. So, again, while they have larger populations, each person in those countries is producing much less pollution overall. Finally, consider the 2 poorest countries in the world, South Sudan and Burundi, which are both located in the continent of Africa. These are 2 examples of countries that have relatively large family sizes, so there's a lot of fertility in that country, and yet their emissions are practically zero. So these are countries where people are still largely farming in small family plots. There's not a lot of machinery. There's not a lot of industry. There's not even a lot of electricity. So many people are doing without those basic goods and services that we take for granted in a wealthier country. And what we see there is that even though these might be countries that have higher fertility, more children per person, they're basically producing almost no pollution at all. So again, if we were focused just on population size, we would ignore the fact that people who live in countries like the United States and Canada, Western Europe, Australia, Japan, are producing a lot more emissions per person. So simply solving population size wouldn't deal with this fact, and we need to figure out a way to produce the goods and services that we need to survive with a lot fewer greenhouse gas emissions. When we turn our attention to the technological side of things, one of the important concepts that can help us with global warming is energy intensity. Energy intensity is simply a measure of how much energy, things like electricity, we need to accomplish a goal that we might have, such as lighting up our room, or to cook our food, or to move around and to get to places using transportation. When we lower energy intensity, what this means is that we're increasing efficiency. We're able to do something with less electricity or less energy than we were able to do in the past. And a good example of this is with this light bulb right here. This is an example of an LED bulb. And when I was a kid, these weren't available at all. The old light bulbs, which were called incandescents, used about 80 to 90% more electricity to produce the same amount of light. This guy right here only uses about 10 watts of electricity, whereas the old-fashioned bulbs that would have produced the same amount of light used to use about 60 watts per bulb. So we've basically cut back the amount of electricity that we need to produce lighting. This is an example of how we can lower energy intensity. So when we make something more efficient, this is going to allow us to use less power, and because power is one of the ways that we create emissions, it's one of the ways that we can help solve global warming by increasing the energy intensity or efficiency of the stuff that we need and the services that we want to have. Another thing that we also need to focus on is the carbon intensity. And what this means is basically how many emissions we're producing to generate the energy that creates the goods and services that we want. When we're able to lower carbon intensity, what this means is that we're able to do the same things with fewer carbon emissions overall. So when I was a kid, Ontario used to have a lot of coal power. So when you were turning on your light switches, or you were turning on your electric oven, or you were watching television, there was a very good chance that you were getting electricity from a coal-fired plant, which is extraordinarily dirty and has a very high carbon intensity. It's releasing a lot of that greenhouse gas pollution that we do not want. Nowadays, however, we have a lot more green sources. We have a lot more wind, we have a lot more nuclear, we have a lot of hydroelectricity, and all of these sources of power produce a lot fewer emissions than coal used to. So what we're able to do now is we have a much lower carbon intensity because we've been able to switch a lot of our electricity sources to these greener and lower emission sources. In the future, we may also see in Ontario more solar power, which is also an example of a lower carbon intensity form of electricity as well. So basically, carbon intensity measures how much pollution we're creating, and energy intensity measures how much energy we need. So in both cases, we can cut back or make global warming better if we either lower the amount of energy that we need, or we make the energy that we do produce fewer pollution. Fewer greenhouse gases. We make it greener, in other words. On this slide, I want to consider how the different components that we've talked about with the Kaya identity can relate to each other with one of my favorite graphics. This graphic is attempting to show how much space people need to move around in different forms of transportation. So cars, buses, and bicycles. And what we see here is that cars take up a lot more space than either buses or bicycles. We also know that cars need a lot more energy. They need regular fuel to be able to move around, and there's also a lot more materials like steel and plastics that go into producing each of these different kinds of cars. Now, one thing we pointed out with the Kaya identity is that people's wealth matters for determining how many greenhouse gas emissions are produced. And one of the trends that we know is that as people get richer, they tend to buy more private cars. So in a lot of poorer countries around the world, people are getting around by walking or bicycling, which are very low energy and carbon intensity activities. They don't generate a lot of pollution. But as we make more money, we tend to opt for things like cars, which obviously take a lot more materials to make and a lot more fuel and a lot more pollution in order to work. And in recognition of the fact that cars produce a lot of pollution, we have a lot of city, provincial, and national governments really interested in switching how people transport themselves around. So if we were to get all of those people in cars into buses or bicycles instead, it would lower the energy intensity. We would need a lot less energy to get the same things that we want. So we want to get to the grocery store, we want to get to work, we want to get to school. If we're able to do it by bus or by bicycle, then we're going to do it much more efficiently. We're going to do it with a lot less power overall, a lot less gas, or other things that we need to move us around. So switching transportation modes can help us lower energy intensity, and this is why there's a lot of focus on things like bike lanes and better bus systems as a global warming solution. Another thing that we could also do, however, is that we could electrify forms of transportation like cars and buses as well. So in Ontario, most of our electricity is coming from relatively low polluting sources. So we have a lot of hydroelectricity, a lot of wind, and a lot of nuclear power. So if we're able to power our cars with electricity, we're going to produce a lot less pollution than if we're putting diesel fuel or gasoline in our vehicles. And the good news is that we can electrify both cars and buses. So if we were to get around in electrified buses, we would actually get the benefit of both lower energy intensity and lower carbon intensity. But again, what this points out is that there's multiple ways to essentially influence the amount of emissions that a society is producing or that an individual is producing. So if we're able to switch the kinds of technology or how efficient our technology is, it can make a really big influence over the amount of emissions that are being produced. So in summary, when we use the Kaya identity or the Kaya equation to understand climate change, one of the benefits is that it highlights multiple ways that different factors influence each other. And it points out that the amount of pollution being produced in the world today is influenced by things like population size, the amount of wealth or GDP produced by individuals or countries, and the energy and carbon intensity of the different technologies that we use to produce our stuff and to create our goods and services. So thank you for listening, everyone. I always encourage you, if you have any questions about any video, to please ask me, and I would be happy to clear them up for you. Thank you for listening, everyone, and until next time, when I'll see you then.